Good evening and welcome to the first annual Quock Walker Day, aka Massachusetts Emancipation Day celebration. My name is Sean Osborne and I am the president of the Association of Black Citizens of Lexington. Tonight, it is my pleasure to be able to introduce you to a set of wonderful panelists who will talk to you about the different aspects of the Quock Walker case, the man, his people. And before we go too far tonight, I will start with a slideshow to give everyone some background information. So our first speaker tonight is Philip James. Philip James is the History Department Coordinator at Lincoln Sudbury Regional High School. He is also a longtime resident of Lexington. He earned his bachelor's degree from Harvard University and his master's degree from Brown University. This evening, Mr. James will be talking about the importance of Quock Walker Day and Massachusetts Emancipation Day. Ladies and gentlemen, Philip James.
Thanks, Sean, for that introduction. As Sean said, I have taught history, and American history very specifically for several decades. And I want to center my few remarks this evening around teaching of history and why having Quock Walker Day being recognized by the state will be so important to not only the teaching of history, but for all folks in the Commonwealth. I double checked before this evening about something called the Massachusetts State Frameworks, which some of you may know about. They are the guidelines that teachers use to know what they should be teaching about in their classrooms. And in the guidelines for American history, there are references to emancipation of slaves in Massachusetts, and there's even a connection to documents that connect specifically to the Quock Walker case, which is all excellent. It's very, very good, but I still think that there are very few people who know the name of Quock Walker. So even though we have this embedded in our curriculum and people are teaching about it, I really don't think that many people across the Commonwealth know about this. Um, I would also, in connection with learning and teaching, thinking about what's happened over the past year. We know that Juneteenth has become, in the last year, not only a state holiday, it's become a federal holiday. And I would be pretty confident in stating that before last year, there were many people across Massachusetts, across the nation, who had no idea what Juneteenth was, what it signified, why it was important in the Black community. Now that day has become a holiday, and it's not just that it's become a holiday that is significant, it's the conversations it starts. It's getting us thinking about the Black community and its role in the United States. I know that in my own high school, we have had now two um, observances of Juneteenth. Last year, there was a very small one because we were still in the middle of a pandemic and very few people could attend. And this year we had one where schools were more open and we had students participating. And I think more importantly than just having students participating, people knowing about it, it was the conversations that have been started about African Americans in America that I think is very important, connecting the Juneteenth holiday. In the same fashion, if Quock Walker Day, or when Quock Walker Day is recognized, it'll begin those same kinds of conversations that I think will be so important across the Commonwealth. Here in Massachusetts, we pay a lot of attention to our history, but some kinds of history gets more foregrounded than others. We know that there was slavery in Massachusetts, but I think a lot of people are not aware of that. I'm thinking of a conversation I had maybe a couple of years ago with some friends talking about the royal estate over in Medford and how there are slave quarters there that one can visit. And I think there are lots of people who are not aware. My friends are not aware that there were slave quarters right here, not far from where they live, within a few miles. So I think that when a day is recognized, it really helps to make things more known. It begins conversations about all kinds of things that is very important for, I think, all of us in the Commonwealth to know about. Another connection, I think, with the Commonwealth and our history is the whole idea of liberty. We know that Massachusetts is often referred to as the cradle of liberty and the birthplace of American liberty. I believe that's the name for Lexington itself. And we know that freedom and liberty is an important word in our country. The interpretations of that word can start many a conversation, many an argument. Some people hold on to that word in a way that is sometimes, some would argue, counterproductive, the actual idea of freedom and liberty. So, but it's still a very, very important word in our culture. If what we know that we just had July 4th this last week, or this past Sunday, and that's supposed to express the United States independence, its freedom from Great Britain. We also know that at that time, when the war was fought, freedom meant certain things for certain people and certain things for other people. We all know that that freedom was not gained by all people by getting independence from Great Britain. So that word freedom is very important, but freedom is only gained over many, many, many years, and for people fighting for freedom. I think that one of the interesting things about recognition of Quock Walker Day is it brings another idea of freedom into the conversation. The idea, of course, of emancipation, and that emancipation for Black people in the Commonwealth only came after this particularly very, very important court case. So Quock Walker Day also feeds into that whole narrative of freedom, of liberty, of the continual press and fight for freedom, which the country is still doing right up to this very moment in time. I also think another important idea connected with this is that the excuse me, the Commonwealth becomes a center of abolition later on in the 19th century. That's abolition for slavery where it still exists. That we know it didn't exist in the 19th century in the Commonwealth here in Massachusetts, but obviously it existed everywhere else. The recognition of Quock Walker Day was sort of connect that idea of abolition back to the abolition of slavery in the Commonwealth, sort of create a more complete picture of what Massachusetts' role has been in the fight, again, for freedom and for liberty. Yes, Massachusetts was important in 19th century, but in the 18th century, Africans or people of African descent were pushing and fighting for their own abolition right here in the Commonwealth. And I think that is another important part of the narrative. Last thing I'd want to say is that, again, coming back to the whole idea of these conversations have been happening, as we know, in the country over the last year about racial reckoning, about the history of people of African descent in the United States, all that coming, unfortunately, from the murder of George Floyd. Those conversations have been eye-opening, and I think they've been informative. It gets people thinking about things they had not thought before. So many people would say, "Oh, I did not know this aspect of history. I didn't know how people experience things." By having this day recognized by the Commonwealth, those conversations will start up again, will continue, I should say. They've already started, will continue, and they'll center in on our own important history right here in Massachusetts that we have not really fully recognized to this moment in time. So I would just want to say in closing, just the important things to kind of remember, that a recognition of the day, it will bring about conversations. It will do even more than anything that would be in any state frameworks. The recognition of that day connects back to the important ideas that we hold not only in the Commonwealth, but also in the country, the ideas of freedom, the ideas of liberty. It also points to the important role that Massachusetts has played in the abolition of slavery across the nation, and the important role that the Commonwealth has really played in our nation's history. So for all those reasons, I really do think that this would be a very, very important thing for the state to do, to acknowledge this day, and so that more people will know who the name of Quock Walker is, and it won't be just something that, oh, I've never heard of that before. It'll become hopefully part of the language of people who grow up and live in Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. James. I appreciate your words and again, helping us move forward as to why it's important for teachers like yourself to incorporate this story into their curriculum, as well as not just for now, but for the broader conversations that can come from talking about how Quock Walker and other enslaved Africans and their descendants were in Massachusetts and were emancipated. Our next speaker is Dr. Zini Magabani. She's a professor of sociology at Boston College. She has a courtesy appointment with the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies. She's also a dear friend from our youth and the daughter of anti-apartheid struggle veteran and well-known academic, Professor Bin Maghubani. She earned her bachelor's degree from Princeton University and her master's and PhD from Harvard University. At Boston College, Dr. Maghubani teaches courses in post-colonial studies, race, ethnicity, and pop culture. This evening, she will share with us the economics and evolution of slavery and indentured service in New England. Dr. Maghubani?
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for the invite. So I'd like to begin by sharing some words that were spoken by the great abolitionist and orator Frederick Douglass, who said two things. Well, he said many things, but in a speech in Faneuil Hall, he was speaking to a crowd of people in Boston, in Massachusetts, and he asked the question, New Englanders, you always say, what have we to do with slavery? And New Englanders tended to feel that they had nothing to do with it because we didn't have very large plantations. We certainly had slavery, but it seemed that slavery was something that took place somewhere else in the West Indies and other places. And so what Douglass was pointing out is encapsulated in his second quote, which he said, the very first deep South of New England was not the American South, Mississippi, Alabama, the places that we think of the cotton plantations. He said the first deep South for New England was the West Indies. And what he was talking about was the importance of the enslavement of Africans in the West Indies to the evolution and growth of economies in New England. So to understand that connection, we need to think a little bit about how the plantation economies worked. Essentially, these islands, it was most economical that every square inch of territory was given over to the growing, particularly of sugar. Cotton and indigo and other products were, of course, extremely important, but sugar was the gold of its day. It was more economical for them to completely clear the islands of every stick of everything and make plantations and import everything else. So they didn't make their own shoes, they didn't grow their own food, they didn't even keep trees to restock, to build their own houses. Everything was imported from elsewhere. And that elsewhere was New England. So if they needed cattle, they oftentimes turned to Massachusetts and Connecticut. And even in Worcester, where Quock Walker's was living during the time of enslavement, it was well known for the growing of cattle. If they needed wood, Maine was the place to go because, again, they didn't bother to keep any trees. They cleared them out to make plantations. Everybody likes to go to Cape Cod. Cod was known as the main food source for enslaved persons on the plantation, dried cod. All of that came from New England. So all of our economies were built on the backs of West Indian slavery. They didn't make their own clothes. They didn't make their own food. And although, for example, slaves were not well dressed, they needed to be dressed. And so the shoe manufacture, the manufacture of clothes, the manufacture of what everybody ate, the constant supply of wood, because plantations burned down to the ground all the time. The favored symbol of New England, the whale, right? Most famously epitomized in the Vineyard Vines logo, those very overpriced clothing that one can find in upscale places like Nantucket and the Chestnut Hill Mall, right? Why would they choose the whale? Why are whales on everything in New England? Well, basically the brains of those spermaceti whales were used for candles that lit the plantations. And one thing about the manufacture of sugar, the harvesting, during certain parts of the year, they had to work 24 hours a day. And all of those lamps the whale oil was used as the source to light them. So New England was booming on the back of slavery, all the while being able to tell themselves, we don't have anything to do with that. We don't have very many slaves here. And the few slaves we have are employed in what they call domestic or farm or family situations, right? Well, we didn't have big plantations, and we did not have them because we were so-called nice people. We didn't have them because, as anyone who looks out the window today, we don't have the weather for it. right? We don't have the weather to grow cotton in large mass, indigo, sugar. We simply don't. The types of farming that flourished in New England was smaller family farms. So of course they did use enslaved labor, no question about it. The hills and the woods and the backwoods, anyone who's ever taken a walk through Massachusetts backwoods or Connecticut, where I grew up, will see miles and miles of small stone walls that were used to mark off the farms. W.E.B. Du Bois once said, there were enough stone walls built in New England by slaves that they could stretch to the moon and back. So maybe he was, overreaching a little bit of colorful language, but what he was pointing out was who laid down all those stones to mark the territory. So once it was dispossessed from the Native Americans, you had to mark off where did someone's farm start and where did the other person's end. And so miles and miles and miles of stone walls built by enslaved persons. And of course, enslaved persons, again, worked doing a variety of different things, which I think leads some insight into, why Quock Walker had the life that he did and felt empowered to make some of the moves that he did, is because of the nature of the way in which labor was compelled in New England was necessarily different from what you would do to control people on a plantation working in the form of gang labor to produce a large agricultural commodity for export, right? So people, again, they like to say that New England slavery was somehow kinder, as though you were talking about different amounts of the same substance. You're not. You're talking about radically different ways of compelling and controlling labor. So Quock Walker, it's often said, and the people who know more about him, I'll leave the details to them, but that he had a high level of skill, right? And of course, that is the sort of thing that the slaves in New England had a variety of different types of things that they were compelled to do, and a level of autonomy had to be granted to them simply to get the type of work done that their master wanted done, right? So again, not out of the kindness of the master's heart, but rather because at the end of the day, the way in which the master reproduced himself, the way in which he became wealthy, was through the labor of the slave, having the slave produce the most of whatever it is that they wanted. And some people, you got the most out of them by beating them within an inch of their life. But if somebody has to do a different type of task, a different type of labor control will be necessary, but also a different set of calculations. And so when we think about the context of Quock Walker's life, and in particular, and again, the people that know a bit more about the details will be able to fill some of this in, but I always found it interesting that the first person to whom he was sold, who owned him, promised him freedom, I believe, at the age of 21, and then a later person at the age of 25. And again, New Englanders like to pat themselves on the back that, that they had a tradition, or that sometimes they would grant their enslaved persons their freedom. So I'd like to add a little bit of texture to that sort of story and talk about how that family might have been doing that more out of their own self-interest, even though clearly Quock Walker took it to heart. He never forgot what he was promised. But oftentimes, again, to maintain a slave for life, right? The slave is productive for a certain portion of their lifetime. But the master is always thinking ahead to at what point in this person's life are they no longer going to be productive for me, right? And if this person, they viewed the enslaved person as an asset that would, at some point in their life, no longer deliver the same return. And therefore, what we will see is, more and more people released towards the end of their life when they are no longer productive to their master, but the master would still be required to so-called maintain them, right? So they're doing these calculations. They're also doing calculations about to control another human being, especially in the conditions of New England slavery, where they weren't just working in gangs on big plantations, but rather sometimes had to have a certain amount of mobility to get the work done, moving from point A to point B, having a certain skill level. how are you going to, like, the straightforward terror or beating is not going to get out of that person the necessary labor in the way that you want it, right? It's not the same sort of thing as growing crops on a plantation. So oftentimes, in order to give themselves a bit of an insurance policy, that perhaps if I promise the person their freedom in the future, it will be a form of a way to maintain control today, right? Not only will perhaps they will not take off, leave, disappear, any number of things, become rebellious if promised their freedom. And also, I'm thinking ahead. I mean, remember, this was the 1780s. People did not live as long as we live today. So you're thinking, well, perhaps he'll make it to 25 or 28. Perhaps he'll be maimed, he'll be old. So for a variety of reasons, that Quock Walker's owner might have made this promise to Quock that I will free you at 25 or at 21. Within the larger context of indentured servitude, so again, we forget that, New England is this complicated place that has both enslaved persons originating on the continent of Africa, but also large numbers of indentured white servants coming from England. And those indentured servants, in order to basically entice them across the sea into an uncertain environment, were promised that after 7 years service, they would get something called freedom dues, which was usually going to be a parcel of land, a gun, maybe some animals, like something to start you off on your life. Because it wasn't like today. You didn't go work for someone. You didn't go work at like Starbucks. Wage labor was not the way the economy was put together. That it was recognized that in order for a man to sustain himself, he had to have a piece of ground. He had to have some animals, because you basically made most of the things that kept you going. So within that context of many, many white servants, it was quite normal for them to be promised freedom dues. This would have been something that would have been in Quock Walker's mind as well. And even that the person who promised that at such and such an age, I'm going to free you, that, I'm not just going to release this person with absolutely nothing, that freedom dues are something that you have coming to you. Now, again, all of the masters are making the calculation that many of the white servants wouldn't live long enough to get them, right? And so again, you're making these promises with the calculation that possibly this person will never live long enough to get what's due to them, or by the time that it comes, they might never live long enough to collect what's due to them. But in Quock Walker's mind, he is keenly aware that this promise has been made, and keenly aware again that it was not so much out of the frame of reference, right? We today feel like there were these massive distinctions. You are from Africa, I am from Europe. You are white, I am Black. In those days, the condition of compelled labor, of which the indentured servants also considered themselves to be, shared more similarities than differences. Even the notion, of course, there's the big who could be enslaved for life. But practically speaking, for many white indentured servants, it ended up being a life sentence because they didn't live that long, right? So the notion that Quock Walker, he would have seen what white indentured servants got and have considered himself, that's why I think in many ways he may have been so, very empowered about what he was going to ask for, what he was going to get. I am a free man. This promise has been made to me. I am going to insist that this promise is kept. And that the people around him also had some sort of notion about, this is a bit of something in our social formation, that indeed people are promised their freedom, that indeed he does have a case here. It's not so much out of the realm of possibility. And so during that time, the way in which Quock Walker likely, again, the people who know more about his life story, but the social context in which he lived, the idea of being released from servitude and being owed something by your master, and that promises about freedom should be taken seriously. And again, that he felt empowered to pursue it in a court of law. And also the fact that, in the days before so much was written down, again, I think that the notion that of he lived in a community, and that when these promises are made, even when people die. So one of his big problems is like two of the people who make the promise die before he's of age. And the fact that a community, it is in the business. I mean, again, why people after they are free tend to stay where they are is that you need other people to say, yes, indeed, that this promise was made, right? Like, again, in before written records were such a thing, or they might get lost or whatever, your neighbors being able to say, so-and-so said it, yes, it's true, was very important. And again, all of that in that context of, the time during which Quock Walker lived and worked. So I guess my closing thing is just, right now everybody's in this massive debate over critical race theory. Like, it's this boogeyman that's coming to get us all, or that, critical race theory means you're going to tell all these bad lies about American history. And what I'd like to point out is this move to commemorate Quock Walker and to remember slavery in New England and to acknowledge New England's own ties to slavery is also, to me, part of critical race theory, right? Like, it's not only, it is saying both, it is giving a full picture of the history of the United States and how we got to be where we are. And despite all of this terror or hysteria that it's going to teach children to hate white people or teach people to feel guilty about who they are, I think what we see happening here is the amazing things that something like critical race theory can do. I consider this move of commemoration and this move, again, to remember the complicated history of the United States and of New England in particular, and that we too, in the words of Frederick Douglass, had something to do with slavery, is also part of what a robust curriculum that incorporates these principles could look like. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you, Dr. Magamani, for bringing us the complexity of American history. Our next speaker is Dr. Robert Bellinger, another Lexington resident, wonderful historian and scholar. He's a cultural historian of the African Atlantic world, which means that his approach to research is from a Black studies perspective. That is, it's interdisciplinary. Professor Bellinger believes that all people have agency and thus have played a role in the creation of history. He holds positions in several professional organizations, including the Mass Historical Society and the Colonial Society of Massachusetts. He's an active member of the African American Historical and Genealogical Society. Currently, Professor Bellinger is working with the Lexington Historical Society, one of our sponsors, to research the history and slavery in Lexington, Massachusetts, to expand the interpretation of this historic community. Tonight, we will have the pleasure of listening to Dr. Bellinger talk about the historical importance of the Quock Walker decision. Dr. Bellinger?
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this wonderful panel. I want to say that in starting off, it's interesting that Philip James started out by mentioning Juneteenth, and that's an important thing, given that this is the first year it's a national holiday. But Juneteenth is near the end of the long march of emancipation. And Quock Walker, the case which gave him freedom, is near the beginning of that long march. So the two are interesting bookmarks or for looking at emancipation, looking at concepts of liberty, looking at concepts of freedom. What I'm going to talk about today, and I'll try to be brief, but I want to start by saying that big events like the ending of slavery are never the result of a single event, but a single event may be the catalyst, the final straw, as it were, that makes for change. And starting with that, there are some things I want to say about the concept of freedom that is mentioned in the Massachusetts Constitution, the series of actions that led to the end of slavery, and to kind of talk a little bit about or present perspective from a slightly different, hopefully, place. Let's start off, as we talked about, the Declaration of Rights of the Inhabitants of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, as stated in the Constitution, that all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the right of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, in fine, that of seeking and obtaining their safety and happiness. Now, this is the section that really speaks to the Quock Walker case and is engaged in the nature of that case. Now, the question of where this phrase comes from is often raised. In some sources, you will hear that Judge John Lowell, who was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention that wrote that 1780 document, is responsible for the wording of that. In other sources, you might hear that John Adams, who had attended many of the different freedom suits that took place in the years before, was responsible for inclusion of this. I think it's a lot broader than that. The concept that the document lays out is based on the idea of natural rights. And during the Enlightenment era, natural rights developed as part of the social contract theory. Now, it was addressing not only the relationship of government to man, but also the relationship of rights to human beings. And this is something that was in very, very big discussion at the time on both sides of the Atlantic, and I'll say across the Atlantic world. And the fact that it was something that was in discussion, not only among people like Judge Lowell or John Adams, is the 1774 petition of a great number of Blacks to the Royal Governor Thomas Gage, issued in Massachusetts. And one of the phrases from there is that your petitioners apprehend we have in common with all other men, as we are a free-born people and have never forfeited this blessing by any compact or agreement whatever. This is 2 years before we find that memorable phrase in the Declaration of Independence, and they are making it clear we are free-born people. We have not given up that, right? Even though we have been enslaved, we have not given up these natural rights which we have gotten from God. In 1779, 20 people of African descent living in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, petitioned the New Hampshire legislature for their freedom. And one of the phrases in there is that natives of Africa, now forcibly detained in slavery in said state, most humbly showeth that the God of nature gave them life and freedom upon the terms of the most perfect equality with other men. That's the natural rights. That's the same idea as we find in the Massachusetts Constitution, written 3 years after the Declaration of Independence and a full year before the Massachusetts 1780 Constitution. And between the two pieces I read was the Declaration of Independence and its memorable phrase that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This concepts, the reason all of these sound similar is because the idea of natural rights was something that was in heavy discussion. It would have been blowing up Twitter if Twitter existed at the time. Between the 1760s and 1780s, you had almost 30 different freedom suits entered in Massachusetts by enslaved people. Most of them went to court and progressed to an appeal in Superior Court. And in just about every case, I think there was one exception, the plaintiffs won their freedom. Now, most of this was based on points of law, not on the concept of natural rights. But the fact that these cases were coming up were very, very important. More and more people were going to the courts. And one of the impacts on these decisions was something that happened across the Atlantic, the Somerset case of 1772, which was taken to read, and I'm not going to get into the particulars of what the case actually meant, but many people who heard about it, and it got a lot of press through the abolitionists and through the newspapers, many people felt that it meant that slavery was no longer allowed in England. And it empowered many people to begin to seek redress through the courts for an end to their own enslavement. In the 1770s and 1780s also, there were a number of resolutions to end slavery that made their way into the legislature. They were generally banned and not passed, but the idea about slavery, bringing it to an end, challenging the slave trade, were things that came up a great deal. Even if we look at the Declaration of Independence, in the initial draft, one of the complaints against the King of England was that he was responsible not only for the slave trade, but also for slavery. And that was taken, that was the most altered section of that document. And it was led down to just talk about domestic insurrections. And if I have time later, I can unfold that a little more. So during this time period, between the 1760s, 1780s, the time when you also had the Great Awakening and the ideas of God and man's relationship to God were very big, all of these cases were happening. In 1781, a case that is often mentioned in relationship to the Quock Walker case is that of Elizabeth Freeman, also known as Mum Bet, in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. The lawyer for Mum Bet, she sued for her freedom. This was one of the freedom suits that entered into the courts. And her lawyer, Theodore Sedgwick, argued that slavery was illegal under the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution, Declaration of Rights, right? That since all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights, that slavery was no longer allowed in Massachusetts. The jury agreed with this argument, and she and another man who was in the suit, Brome, were freed. However, Colonel Ashley did not pursue an appeal of this verdict, so it never went to a higher court. And so it did not have the same impact in memory or others as cases that made it to the superior courts would have had. And that brings us to the case of Quock Walker, which was a series of about 6 cases, which started in 1781, the same year as Elizabeth Freeman's case. In the final of the cases, in his charge to the jury, the Supreme Judicial Court Chief Justice William Cushing announced that slavery was incompatible with the new Massachusetts Constitution. He said, the court are therefore fully of the opinion that perpetual servitude can no longer be tolerated in our government, and that liberty can only be forfeited by some criminal conduct or relinquished by personal consent or contract. Right? Now, this was his charge to the jury, right? This was not a legal binding decision of the court. It was what he told the jury. The jury found that Quock Walker was free, but we speculate it was because of the charge, but we do not know that for sure. The decision could have been the claim of a prior promise of manumission that was given to Quock Walker. We also know that it was not given a great deal of coverage in the Boston newspapers at the time, so it did not spread in the same way as the Somerset case did. And we know that slavery continued in form at least until the end of the 18th century and slowly began to die out. One of the things that happened is that they began to list those who were enslaved as servants, not as enslaved people. And some said that this was because the census taker made it clear that no one was saying they had slaves, and no one wanted to be the only one to say such in the 1790 census. The fact is that many of those who were listed as servants, right, were also children who were put under terms of having indentures till 21 or 25, depending upon the nature of that indenture. So those children who were still enslaved in 1783 would still be enslaved by the end of the 18th century. The point that I'm making is that while Quock Walker is an important figure, and this case stands out, it was by no means the only case. It was the one that gets the most recognition because it was connected to that phrase in the Constitution. We know that the end of slavery in Massachusetts came as a series of actions by many, a movement as it were. It was in the writings of those who wrote about it. It was in the actions of those who took cases to court. It was in the actions of those who self-emancipated themselves, and it would lead to an end of slavery. So even though we recognize this case as the one, hopefully, as with Juneteenth, recognizing that there were many other events of emancipation beginning in the 1780s in Massachusetts, for example, leading up over 80 years, we should also realize that the Quock Walker case is the culmination of a series of events and actions by many individuals, male and female, who acted to on the purpose of emancipation. And I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bellinger. So many things are process. We select a date as in this commemoration, and we recognize it's a process. The process for Quock Walker was from 1781 to 1783, and as we will hear, from others, and if you do some more research, you will see that his journey, like the journey of so many Black people in America, was an ongoing struggle for equality. So I thank you for your remarks. And our next speaker is the Ambassador of Ghana to the United States of America. I am very grateful that the Ambassador has made the time to join us. It is almost midnight in Ghana, and I'm glad that so far, everything looks good. So, Dr. Ajay Beriwa is the current Ambassador of Ghana to the United States of America, with concurrent accreditation to Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, Costa Rica, and the Dominican Republic. His first ambassadorial assignment was as the ambassador to Japan, with concurrent accreditation to Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea. He earned his bachelor's degree in geography from the University of Ghana, his master's degree from the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, and his PhD from Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. He's a certified chaplain and a statesman in he's a certified chaplain and a statesman in residence at WPI in Worcester. He is one of the architects of the Year of Return. And this evening, he will discuss how we can continue to strengthen the bond between Black peoples of the African diaspora and their cousins in Africa, specifically in Ghana. Ambassador?
Yeah, currently we have a new ambassador in Washington, D.C. I ran my 4-year term of office, so I'm back in Ghana. First of all, thank you for the invitation. And then also I would want to thank all the speakers for the education that I have received this evening. which I'm quite sure is the kind of education I couldn't pay for. But I think the issue of the year of return, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I was promoting it, was just not to put a marker on 400 years of people who left, our shores. We were basically trying to recognize the contribution of those people who left Africa, obviously against their will, and the contribution that they made and they are still making to American society and American civilization. See, we believe that these were people who left our shores against their will. Their journey, obviously, was very difficult. They came to a country they didn't know. They had to cope with a language that they never heard of, most of them. And their employment circumstances were so excruciating that, in fact, to get the best out of them was actually a long stretch. So we were trying to recognize that contribution. The fact that they persevered, the fact that they had to cope with this language they never heard of, and the fact that most of them became so adept with the language that they wrote books, they wrote songs, they wrote sonnets, and if I make an impact on American civilization by the utilization of that word, of that language. And I always say that if I wanted to hear the smooth run of the English language, I'll go to a Black American church on Sunday and listen to some of the preachers. The images they paint, the belief that they pump through the use of the word. These are indices of people who obviously had a lot of ingenuity, had a lot of resistance, had a lot of resilience, and under the hardest of circumstances, made good a contribution to America. And sometimes you even look at the humble traffic light. And if somebody told you that it has a relationship with, an ex-slave, it should tell you something significant. But the import of the year of return was also to look at the fact that we on the African continent have always considered, Black Americans as brothers and sisters. The only difficulty is that we have a pond between us. The only difficulty was that your very existence, politically and such, were also difficult. The difference was also because the stories that you were told about the mother continent had never been very palatable, especially in the earlier years. And therefore, people were made to feel that you shouldn't feel very nostalgic about that place because what you have is far more superior than what they have out there. But we do believe that after 400 years of that kind of separation, we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to those in the diaspora to make sure that the story is more or less cleaned up and that we get you to understand that you are family. And therefore, we invited you home because we do believe that home is where you go and they have to take you in without question. So the essence of the year of return was to try and build a bridge across this pond so that we can do a certain kind of interface, we can do a certain kind of connectivity, we can do a certain kind of growing together or getting to know each other so that we can exchange the best that we have on both sides. We have to get people to understand that the people who came to Africa and made good, the people who came to Africa and picked up Africans and brought them to America, were never invited. They came by themselves, took what it is that they could, because there wasn't much resistance. But we do realize that if people could come without much preparation, except that they were going for exploitation, and they succeeded, then we also owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to those in the diaspora, that we should also invite them now and make sure that they succeed, because we are brothers and sisters. And you see, for those who probably might not appreciate that much, there are lots of African, Black Americans that I've met for the years that I've spent in the States, who, if they came, for instance, to Ghana, and they didn't speak first, a Ghanaian might speak a Ghanaian language to them, because of even the sheer physical similarity between us. So it is this bond that we were using the year of return to put together and strengthen. One of the lasting experiences I had during the visit of the Black Congressional Caucus and Speaker Pelosi to Ghana during the year of return was when we visited Elmina Castle, and people went to see the fabled year of return, the door of no return. The door where once you get there and it opens, you have to go into the ship, and that's it. And the late Congressman Lewis went to the door, the door of return, the door of no return. And when he came out, he obviously looked particularly shaken. He was overcome with a lot of emotion. So I said, "Oh, Congressman, it looks like this experience has really gotten onto you." And then he says, "Well, it's the kind of encounter that you cannot help getting into your system." And he was getting a bit teary. So I told him, "Congressman, what you have to take and hold tight is the fact that by having come here, this sort of thing will never happen again." And at that, he punched me on the shoulder. We burst into a laughter, and then he relaxed for the whole bit. And you see, the content of it all has to do with the fact that there is a set of population in the United States whose forebears went through so much, but then who have persevered, made significant contributions to the American story, and are still making contributions to the American story. And we are asking them to come to the homes they left, look at what we have, experience the hospitality, have a good look at the socioeconomic possibilities, and take a decision to put something in, because it is also your home. And people will know that in Ghana, we do accept that you have a certain kind of right of abode. So if you wanted to stay, the paperwork is simple enough for you to be able to stay. But the import of it all is that Ghanaians, Africans, and African Americans are blood relatives. And you have to always keep on your mind the fact that Africa is the one continent where, irrespective of which country one comes from, they have no objection to being called an African because the kinship is there. In the other places, you have to call the country first before you call the continent. So we have a certain kind of solid relationship that we would want to build, that we are inviting African Americans, Black Americans to, help build. Because whichever way you look at it, we are related. So in trying to organize the year of return, part of it was also to use it as a promotion for economic integration, for economic relationship, for socioeconomic impact on all of us. If we are able to do so, maybe probably the tensions on this planet could be reduced, because we constitute a certain hefty population of the world. And therefore, if we are able to maintain a certain, good relationship, if we are able to maintain a certain kind of sanity, if we are able to maintain a certain kind of understanding, maybe the prospects of the world would be better, because the tensions, across the globe could well be also reduced. We are not promising that the best in the world or the best of the world will simply drop, on our feet because we related. But we do promise that a certain kind of decent relationship, a certain kind of intent to promote understanding, a certain kind of will to recognize that we have commonalities of interest. That is going to be, the achievement that we should all be aspiring for. Mr. Walker's story, for me, underlies the resilience of African Americans that I mentioned earlier. Mr. Walker's story underlies the perseverance that, the Africans who were brought to North America also, exhibited. And when you look around and size up, as it were, the totality of that experience, the totality of that contribution, the totality of that innate intent to help build a country, obviously it means that if you could do it for North America, come and join us and do it for Africa. This is what we aim for. And I believe that we owe to ourselves the necessity to stand up, build a bridge across the pond, and make a certain kind of community, a certain kind of communication, a certain kind of family reunion possible. And I do believe that African Americans and their, Africans in the diaspora are obviously in a position to do this. I want to thank you for the gift of your attention. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. That was wonderful. I've heard someone say recently that someone who is not comfortable going home is uncomfortable in general, and so the parents of Quock Walker, Mingo and Dinah, they did not just come from the ground; they came from a peoples. They were Akan and or Iwe peoples, and and they were separated from those people, and their child was born in the Western Hemisphere, and yet they still have that heritage, and that's why I'm glad you're able to join us, Ambassador. I appreciate your time tonight. Our next speaker is Dr. Karima Lewis, and she will continue down that that path of talking about the West African roots of Quock Walker and his parents. Dr. Lewis teaches history part-time at Massasoit Community College, Quincy College, and Emerson College in Massachusetts. She's worked in the field of social work and law before becoming an historian. She holds a bachelor's degree from Northwestern, a master's of social work from Hunter College School of Social Work, a JD from New York University School of Law, a PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley. Dr. Lewis wrote her dissertation on the history of slave resistance in colonial New England. This evening, she will talk about the Akan diaspora in Massachusetts. Dr. Lewis.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for this invitation to present this evening. I'd like to tell the ambassador that when I decided that I would go outside the United States, the first place I went was Ghana when I was 19 years old. And let's see, I gotta go back here. Let's stop here. And I did go back. I've gone back 4 times, and I was there for the year of the return. So I have an affinity to Ghana. Okay, let's see if I can do this correctly. Okay, and so I want to talk about the Akan presence in colonial New England. I've kind of done a PowerPoint because I want to make this a visual presentation so we can understand, you know, how these Africans from the Gold Coast, which is later known as Ghana, arrived in New England. And so in my own work in resistance, I try to analyze my rebels who are rebelling according to their African heritage. You know, why are they doing some of the things they're doing? Because of this African heritage. We can paint a broad brush and say African, but who are these Africans? That's the question we need to ask. And so I know that another guest will hopefully go into the culture of the Akan. So I'm just going to talk about the Akan presence in New England. And before we talk about the Akan presence, we have to take note of the 12 million or more African captives that were brought out of West Africa. And so of those 12 million, we know they came from various places, including Ghana. And so in my own work that I've looked at, slave ship voyages that left the Gold Coast and came to, will make their way to New England, I found that just a sample of 60 ships in the transatlantic slave trade database, that these Boston slave ships, yes, Boston was involved in the slave trade, from 1700 to 1773, they made 21 stops along the Gold Coast as compared to 11 in other West African locations. So the Gold Coast was that place in the 1700s that many of the British and American slave ships went to. But we know that Rhode Island had a more hefty trade, even than Boston. They had over 900 voyages to West Africa over the time in the 1700s. And so in this sample of just 65 Rhode Island ships that go to the Gold Coast, different stops, Cape Coast Castle, the Guinea Coast, Anamabu, they made 84 stops along the Gold Coast. Whereas here, they made basically, place here, they made 12 stops in these other West African countries. So 84 to the Gold Coast and 12 to these other areas. So the Gold Coast was that place of choice. And so, but we know that for Africans in New England, that most of them came to New England by way of the West Indies, the British West Indies. They came by way of Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, St. Kitts, Nevis. And so not as many came directly in slave ships from Africa. They came, so those 900 voyages of Rhode Island, 200-300 captives in a ship, they will always stop in the West Indies first and sell the bulk of those Africans in the West Indies. But I always say that New England slave ship captains always brought a few Africans home to New England with them. And so this is from David Eltis's Transatlantic Slave Trade data as far as in his atlas. And we see, you can't see these so good. My scanning didn't come out as good, but there are 200,000 going just from the port of Anamabu to Jamaica, 100,000 going to the Leeward and the Windward Islands, all the other islands. So 300,000 during this period coming from the Gold Coast to Jamaica. And many of those will be transshipped, shipped again to New England. If we look at those ships that went directly from the Gold Coast to New England, there's about 12,000 that have been documented that went from West Africa to New England, but half of them were from the Gold Coast, which was about 6,000. So half of the direct voyages from the from West Africa to New England, half came from the Gold Coast. And so we see that there's a prevalence. The ambassador talked about Elmina Castle. So just to recall that these captives are going to be held in dungeons in these slave castles before. This is Cape Coast Castle, Elmina Castle, very difficult, as Congressman Lewis attests to go through this experience. And I've done it more than once because the door of the return that the ambassador talked about, once you go through this door to the Atlantic Ocean, you are on your way to the Americas. Really, they didn't know where they were going, but they were going to the Americas. And so that's why we say the door of no return. So what is this Akan Iwe culture? And if we look at a map of Ghana, we see that it's pretty prevalent. You know, it's taken up most of this map. The Ashanti, which everyone pretty much knows, but the Akan and the Iwe are there. And so how do we see this presence in New England? And so I'm going to talk about just a few ways, because I know our time is very limited, a few ways that you know that there is an Akan presence in New England. And one of the first ways is to look at ads to sell Africans in New England. Now, this is in Newport, Rhode Island, and it says that this that we have a brig, the Royal Charlotte. It's arrived with slaves from the Gold Coast. But then we also have a runaway ad, and what's his name? Quaco. And we know that that is an Akan name, and he's running away from Middleton, Connecticut, and he is out of there. And so we know that this Akan presence can be seen in many ads. I looked at there's a book, Escape from Bondage. I think it has about more than 500 runaway ads just for New England. You know, so they want to say they ran away from the South. No, but enslaved people in New England were running away as well. And of these ads, I found 19 Cuffies that ran away. I found a Quaco, a Kofi. And so we know that the Akan presence is within these areas where they're showing resistance. But interesting, and a lot of people might not know about this, there's a cultural tradition in New England. You also see it in New York under Pinkster Days in New York. But in New England, there were the election of African kings and African governors. And so many said that it was enslaved people mimicking whites when they went to their elections and that they're just copying it. But these elections of African kings and African governors was far more different than just white elections. The white elections, they would throw these parties with a lot of rum and beer at the tavern, and then they would break out into a big rowdy brawl. But this was a African celebration. You had drumming, dancing, you had food, and you had the king who would borrow the horse of his master, borrow clothes from his master. He had his parade. He had his armed contingent of guards that were behind him. And this was like a royal celebration of African leaders. And some of these leaders had some legal power when it came to minor offenses. You know, if you had been accused of theft, that king or governor could have you whipped for your offense, you know? So they had power, they were leaders. So this was an African celebration. And this happened from the early 1700s way into the late 1800s. And not only in Connecticut, I did a presentation on, sometimes they're called Negro governors and kings, and I looked at the names that have Akan connotations just in this list of the Negro governors in Connecticut. And so this also takes place in Massachusetts as well. And so who are some of those Akan related or Ewe related individuals that we know of? And one is Belinda. Her last name that she used was Sutton, but we know her as Belinda, the enslaved woman of Isaac Royal. And I think one of our, I think Dr. Bellinger talked about the royal estate where you can find slave quarters on that estate even today in Medford. And so Belinda, in 1783, I believe, is going to file a petition. Now she's illiterate because you'll see her X on that form, but she has somebody write this, and she petitions the Commonwealth for an allowance from her master's estate. Now, Isaac Royal was a loyalist, so he ran off to Canada or England. But the estate was still there, and she requested an allowance. She requested reparations, and she received them because she put 70 years of her life into being Isaac Royal's family slave. And so Belinda was born of the Ewe people. She was kidnapped when she was 12 years old. She'll come to Medford and she'll become enslaved by Royal. Many of you know Paul Cuffey. Paul Cuffey was that wealthy whaler. He owned several ships. His father's name was Kofi Slocum. And so he will take the first name of his father. And what's interesting about Mr. Kofi Slocum is that he will teach he had several children, and they will teach them the whaling business. And Paul Cuffey will be successful at that. But knowing his connection to his Akan roots, Paul Cuffey decided, even though he was wealthy, he couldn't vote, he couldn't serve on a jury, his children couldn't go to an integrated school, and being one of few Blacks in the whaling business had to be very difficult. And so he decided to return to West Africa. And working with the British government in Sierra Leone, he organized over 18 people who left from New England and returned to Sierra Leone. And so we know that he will not live long after 1815 when this settlement is organized. He'll die in 1817 in Sierra Leone. But Paul Cuffey. And so I'll just like to close with a little commentary that I wrote on Quock Walker. And that kind of brings out, I think, some of his Akan heritage. And so Quock Walker was born in 1753 in Barre, Massachusetts, to Mingo and Dinah, who were of Akan heritage. The Akan spelling of his name is either Quaco or Quaco, Quaco, or Kwaqku, which is the same name of a boy born on Wednesday in Akan culture. He and his parents were enslaved by James Caldwell, who promised Quock his freedom when he was a boy. His parents must have explained to their son that he would one day be free. Mr. Caldwell died when Quock was 10 years old, but this promise of freedom was not fulfilled. Although the recently widowed Mrs. Caldwell renewed that promise to free Quock by the age of 21, no such promises were made to his parents. True to his Akan heritage of courage and military prowess, Quock's father, Mingo, runs away from the Caldwell estate soon after Mr. Caldwell's death. Quock will never see his father again. And Quock will spend the next 10 years trying to obtain his freedom, to obtain that freedom that was promised to him. Having the resiliency of his Akan ancestors, Quock never gave up on his quest for freedom. When he was not free by age 25 by his late mistress' second husband, Nathaniel Jennison, Quock courageously sought refuge at the home of his first master's sons, but was forcibly returned by Mr. Jennison. He will persevere through a series of court cases that finally reached the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court in 1783. It is at this appeals level that Quock will be granted his freedom when Chief Justice William Cushion relies on the 1781 case of Elizabeth Monbet as precedent to find that slavery was incompatible with the new state constitution, effectively abolishing slavery in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Thank you.
Thank you, Karima Lewis. Appreciate your words, again, communicating the connection between the Akan and Iwe people of West Africa and their brothers and sisters and cousins in Massachusetts and across New England. Those of you who may have noticed, we are at 8:26. We have 3 more speakers. We'll be going slightly over our 8:30 time period. Our next speaker is Osabrima Owusu Baafi Abwaje III. He is the chief of the Achim Janase in Achim Abuaka state in Ghana. He is the appointed member of the Judicial Committee of the Achim Abuaka Traditional Council in Ghana. He and I have been friends for many years, and he was named, in 2019 the outstanding graduate of the last decade Alumni Award by the Suffolk University Law School. This evening, he will provide an overview of the traditions, customs, and leadership in Ghana. Before he speaks, I will play the traditional drums for you. Please stand by. Ladies and gentlemen, Osa Berima.
Yeah, Sean, first of all, thank you. Thank you also to the panel and the ambassador, Dr. Lewis, everybody here. As the ambassador said, this is a free historic education for me. I've lived in Boston for quite some time. And I must say, and I've known Sean for many, many years, this is the most that I've learned about the United States. So I do truly appreciate all that has been presented thus far. And it's an honor to be part of this panel. I happen to be from the Akan tribe. And specifically, as Dr. Lewis knows, it's one of the largest ethnic group in Ghana, which include the Ashantis, the Fantis, and the Achims, which is where I'm from. My wife is African American, and as you had mentioned, with the Amina Castle in 2011, she made the journey to Ghana, and she did go to the castle, and I think the experience is unique for each individual, and that I do encourage folks to go there. As I mentioned, I've lived in Boston for quite some time. I did my education here, and when my uncle passed, the Achimjunase, where I'm from, they said they wanted me to become the chief, which was quite interesting for someone who has spent most of his years over here, But I saw it as an opportunity, not only my experience here, but also to make the link with my people in Junase, where I'm from, because I've always gone there to do projects with students from New England or Boston specifically. Me becoming a chief in the Akan tribe is because of through my mother. The Achims, we are matrilineal. So the woman is very important. And the reason for that unique, matrilineal cultural link is because they know that when a woman gives birth, that the child came from the mother. The father's story, I'll leave it to your all imagination. A chief is social, cultural, and spiritual leader in the town, the city, or village. And throughout Ghana, every community has a chief. What does that mean? That means that every issue, whether it's marital, land dispute, development, government projects, come through you. So you have a lot of power. So because of that, a chief cannot run for political office because you have so much power over your people. And the area where I'm from is the Royal Achimota State Kingdom, which is the eastern region of Ghana, where it's located. The king also happened to have New England link because he lived in Worcester for quite some time before he became a king. And in 2013, he actually came to Boston, where I hope one of my mentors who lives in Lexington, Jamie Hoyt, who has been a mentor to me for over 20 years, met him. The area is one of the largest single traditional areas in Ghana, with a population of over 2 million. And it's very forested, very rich in natural resources. It's divided into divisions because in the old days, the tribes had a lot of tribal wars or fights. So divided into divisions. I happen to from a division where there are 153 communities, and I'm the second in command for that division, which is 152 communities are under me. When I became a chief, the goal for me, and I must say I've only been a chief for 2 years, so I'm a rookie. By no means, I'm also a social justice person, so I care about development and opportunity for disadvantage. So one of the, through the words of the king, was that the geography of a child's birth must not determine that child's destiny. And so I took that to heart to make sure that education, environmental protection, and poverty alleviation was going to be my goal, where I'm from. Within the 2 years, I've partnered with Worcester Polytechnic Institute professors to do projects in the area. I partnered with various African Americans in the Washington, D.C. area in building school, also providing them the opportunity to come home. Like the ambassador said, we're brothers and sisters. And no matter how difficult the circumstances have been here, there's always a place in Ghana that's home for you to come. We've improved the health center. We've also managed to be building developing a community farm, 20 acres of cocoa farm that is going to generate resource so that we can provide scholarship for students to go to college and come back and help their community. And in the interest of time, lastly, we have several tourism attraction area, ecotourism. We have butterfly sanctuary, butterflies with a wingspan of about 6 feet in the forest, monkey sanctuary, you just name it. And I think, this evening provide an opportunity to formulate a lasting partnership between Achimdunase, Achimobiako, and Ghana, so that her Quack Walker's, memories will continue to live and his light will burn bright in the sky. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Osa Berima. Appreciate you sharing your words and possibilities of partnership. And one of the things that we wanted to see happen as we go through this commemoration of Quock Walker Day, that folks have an opportunity to connect with Quock Walker both near and far. And now that we've traveled to the west coast of Africa, let's come back to the other W, Worcester County. And with that, we're going to go with Leslie Chiquette. So Dr. Chiquette is a professor of history at Assumption University. She earned her bachelor's degree in history from Radcliffe College and her master's and PhD from Harvard University. That's now 2 of them on tonight's panel. Dr. Chiquette is a member of a group informally known as the Worcester History Group. That group has been working for years to draw attention to Quock Walker's place in American history. I am so happy to find a group of people that have been working on this project and this aspect of history for so long. And I know that we here in Lexington like to think of ourselves as the center of colonial history. It's nice to remember that there are other counties in our state, and looking forward to learning more about what happened in Worcester County and Berry, Mass. Leslie?
Thank you very much, Sean. It's an honor to participate in this celebration of Quock Walker Day. Sean asked me to tell you the story of how I came to learn about Quock Walker, which is accidentally. Although, as he told you, I'm a professor of history at Assumption University, unlike my colleagues here tonight, I'm not a specialist in African American or in African history. But I am very interested in local history, and I'm also a lover of the outdoors. My favorite pastime is pedaling my mountain bike around the woods of Worcester County, visiting sites of natural and historical interest. So one day about 10 years ago, I happened to be riding in the town of Barry, and I decided to follow an overgrown path that caught my eye. It wound up a long, steep hill, crossed a stone wall, one of those slave-built stone walls, no doubt, then followed along the hilltop to another very rocky spot. As I slowed down to figure out the way through, I suddenly realized I was not looking at any old rock pile or stone wall. This was a small, unmarked cemetery. I got off the bike and looked around for clues. It was enclosed on all sides by stone walls. It was a square plot on the hillside facing a small ravine. And there were about a half dozen grave markers, all but one of them simple field stones. The largest stone was the only one with an inscription, but it was toppled, it was broken, and it was overgrown with moss. But I cleaned it off, and I was able to make out Prince Walker, died April 21st, 1858, aged 84 years. I'm going to share my screen so I can show you a few pictures here. So this is a picture of the cemetery that I took a couple of weeks ago. When I first came on it, it was much more overgrown, all full of weeds and small little trees and everything. But you could see the unmarked field stones in the middle and in the foreground. And then on the left, you see the one in gravestone, toppled, broken. But if you look closely, you can read that it says Prince Walker died, and then the date is actually farther down on the stone. So I got back on my bike and continued my ride, but my curiosity was whetted. And fortunately, I had a good idea of where to go for answers. A few days later, I attended the scheduled meeting of Worcester History Group, which Sean just mentioned. It's an informal gathering of people from all walks of life who are interested in Worcester history broadly defined. So over dinner, I told the story of my bike ride, and I asked if anyone knew who Prince Walker was. And it turns out I came to the right place. Historian Harry Richardson, a retired high school teacher from Shrewsbury, and a member of the Shrewsbury Historical Commission, told me he had been doing research on the Walker family for 40 years. So for the first time, I learned the story of Quock Walker's self-emancipation and his role through his determined use of the legal system in extinguishing slavery in Massachusetts. Now, Prince Walker, whose gravestone we're looking at, was probably Quock's younger brother. Harry told me there was a second monument in Barrie related to the Walker case. And here's a picture of that one. This is a stone. Originally, it had an inscription, but it's no longer legible. And it marks the spot where farmer James Caldwell was caught in a fierce thunderstorm with his slave Mingo, Quock's father, on July 18th, 1763. And when lightning hit the tree where they had taken shelter, Caldwell was killed and Mingo had his leg broken. And the accidental death of the slave owner, who had promised Quock his freedom in adulthood, set off the chain of events leading to the Walker men's self-emancipation. So, like Quock's father Mingo in 1765 and Quock in 1781, Prince, who had been sold out of state in retaliation after Quock won his court cases, Prince too walked away to freedom in 1795. Hence their chosen name, Walker, as Sean pointed out to me. They walked. Prince's owner, John Watson, placed this ad in the Connecticut Courant on May 11th, 1795, offering a $10 reward for runaway Negro boy named Prince, about 5.5 feet high, a scar in his right temple reaching into the hair a little higher than the eye, sign no doubt of a brutal beating, broad shoulders, spindle shanks, a very long foot, and speaks broken English. So his Akan language was his native tongue. Had on, when he went away, a light-colored homespun coat new with large metal buttons. Prince had carried away a man's overcoat, sundry articles of clothing, some money, and this is the touch that I love, he took a fiddle. 5 years later, Prince Walker was listed in the US Census in Barrie as a free man, heading a household of 4 other free persons. In 1803, he purchased his hilltop farm from the daughter of James Caldwell, Quock's former owner. And he married Betsy Dawes of Rutland on Christmas Day in 1805. Sadly, she died just 3 years later at the age of 23. Prince remarried Anna Morse in 1816, and they had 10 children together, 4 of whom died prematurely. So the unmarked stones in the cemetery belong to Prince's first wife, Betsy, and the 4 children that he and Anna lost. Prince could see their graves from his simple cabin directly across the ravine. No cellar hole marks the spot where the cabin stood, just a shallow depression in the ground measuring about 14 feet square. According to Prince's probate record, he owned few personal belongings, but they did include that fiddle, which sold for $1.75 after his death. His surviving children buried him in the family cemetery and erected the stone to honor his memory. After learning the Walker family story, I returned to Barrie, not on my bike this time, but with clippers and a rake, which I used to clear the overgrown path and clean the neglected cemetery. Over the next few years, I led some informal tours of the graves while continuing to do maintenance, but the lack of recognition for this meaningful place bothered me. Yes, the town of Barry had honored Quock Walker with a plaque on the town common, but the burial ground testifies to his whole family and community of proud landowning citizens who had seized their freedom. Once again, Worcester History Group came to the rescue. In 2015, Harry Richardson volunteered to take us on the field trip he used to do with his own students, visiting first the thunderstorm marker and the cemetery in Barry, and then the Princeton graves of 3 slaves owned by Moses Gill. And ironic, this is 2 of them, beautiful engraved stones. Ironically, Moses Gill is the judge who heard Quock Walker's first 2 cases. Thanks to History Group member Al Southwick, former editor of the Telegram and Gazette, we were accompanied by veteran reporter George Barnes, who wrote a nice article afterwards entitled "Path to Freedom: Woods in Barry Hold Markers of Slavery's End en Masse." Al Southwick, who continued to write a weekly column on Worcester history until his death this past spring at age 100, followed up with a column called "Quock Walker's Legacy Lives On." So armed with these 2 articles, I wrote to DCR archaeologist Ellen Birkland, since the land surrounding the cemetery is now part of the DCR-owned Ware River watershed. DCR stands for Department of Conservation and Recreation. Ms. Birkland was eager to learn more, and she quickly arranged for a watershed ranger to give her a tour of the Walker Cemetery. Thanks in part to her efforts, the Barry Cemetery Commission placed an interpretive sign in the cemetery in 2017 with the assistance of students from Montechusett Regional Vocational Technical School. Unfortunately, a planned archaeological dig at the Prince Walker home site by Salem State University students had to be postponed last summer due to COVID. But I'm hopeful it will take place in the future. And in the meantime, I invite you all to come pay your respects to the Walker family the next time you're in Barry. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Coquette. That was wonderful. And for those of you who are keeping score, taking notes, so we have sites in Princeton, sites in Barry, and then from the intro slide, sites in Lowell of Quock Walker Lewis. Perhaps someone will find some sites of minor Walker Lewis in Cambridge as well, as we continue to learn more about the legacy of Quock Walker and his family. So with that, that brings us to next steps. And I am so happy that as part of this journey with Quock Walker, that I've got a chance to interact more with Senator Cindy Friedman and her office. She, if you get a chance to meet her or talk to her, you will learn that she is a wonderful person to work with, and she was elected to the Mass Senate in July of 2017. She represents the 4th Middlesex District, which includes precincts 1 and 2 and 4 and 7 of Lexington, as well as Arlington, Billerica, Burlington, and Woburn. Prior to becoming a state senator, Cindy worked as a public school teacher. That's several of them now on the panel. And she's also executive of a high-tech industry, and later served for nearly a decade as chief of staff to the late Senator Ken Donnelly. She continues to distinguish herself as a thoughtful and policy-oriented member of the Senate. She holds a bachelor's degree in education from Roger Williams University and a master's degree in special ed from Lesley University. And most importantly for us tonight, she is the sponsor of Bill S-2059, an act designating July 8 as Massachusetts Emancipation Day, AKA Quock Walker Day. Senator Friedman.
Thank you, Sean. And thank you to all the presenters, the distinguished presenters. It's been quite an education tonight. This was very educational, and it really underscores how remarkable and historically important Quock Walker's case is. What's ironic, or what's amazing, is that a year ago when Sean approached me with the idea of commemorating July 8th as Massachusetts Emancipation Day, AKA Quock Walker Day, I had no idea who Quock Walker was. And that is a travesty, especially after listening to the stories tonight. So I vowed to do my part to help rectify this. And it was my very great honor to introduce a resolution in the Senate last July commending the many community groups and organizations in the Commonwealth who were commemorating July 8th, 2020 as Massachusetts Emancipation Day and Quock Walker Day. And this past January, with the start of the new legislative session, I filed an act designating July 8th as Massachusetts Emancipation Day, AKA Quock Walker Day. And my House colleague, Representative Michelle Socolo, filed the bill in the House. So this bill would enshrine in Chapter 6 of the Massachusetts General Law a requirement that, quote, the governor annually issue a proclamation setting apart July 8th as Massachusetts Emancipation Day, AKA Quock Walker Day, in recognition of July 8th, 1783, when the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court ruled that the Constitution of the Commonwealth's Declaration of Rights rendered slavery unconstitutional, as well as the significant contributions made by Quock Walker to abolish slavery in the Commonwealth, and recommending that the day be observed in an appropriate manner by the people. So I now need your help, and I need the help of your friends and your neighbors and educators and historians across the Commonwealth, because we need to build a groundswell of support for this bill as it moves through the legislative process. The bill has been referred to the Joint Committee on State Administration and Regulatory Oversight. The committee has not scheduled a hearing yet, but I will be urging the chairs, and in fact, we've reached out to them to schedule that hearing as soon as possible. Once we have a hearing date, we can plan a strategy for letters of support and for oral testimony, either virtual or in a live hearing, where hopefully the Senate and House will be, the State House will be open again. We will need to educate the members of the committee so that they understand the importance of Quock Walker and of this bill. We'll then push it for a favorable report of the committee to keep the bill moving. And I really look forward to you and your help and advocacy to seeing this bill become law, so all in the Commonwealth will know who Quock Walker is and celebrate his emancipation. So thank you so much for inviting me to participate today. I look forward to partnering with you in the months ahead and to make this an official day of recognition in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And again, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this program.
Thank you, Senator Friedman, and thank you to everyone. As we bring this to a close, I will share a PowerPoint so that those of you who were taking notes, you can start doing so now. So again, on behalf of the association, I thank you for joining our community celebration of Quock Walker Day, commemorating July 8, 1783. As you've heard, it's a unique story of abolition of slavery in New England, the agency of not just Quock Walker, but his sister Minor Walker Lewis, and his younger brother, Prince. It's also a story of race amity and of the ongoing journey towards racial equality and reaching back to brothers, sisters, and cousins in West Africa. I invite all of you who have not already registered to sign up for the Quock Walker Day Hike for Freedom this Saturday. So far, it looks like the storm will have passed by Saturday morning, 8 o'clock. As Senator Friedman just talked about, these are the two bills, S2059, H3117. You can find out more information about them and track them at that web site there, MAlegislature.gov. I'm so happy that Dr. Chiquette shared those pictures. Again, I invite you to go to Princeton and to Barry and to Lowell and talk to the folks in Cambridge about these sites of Prince Walker and Minor Walker Lewis, and perhaps you'll find something more about Kwaku Walker Lewis in Lowell and in Boston, and of course of Quock Walker in Barrie. Be great to continue to work with the ambassador and with Osa Berima on different initiatives, both here in Massachusetts and in Ghana. You've also heard about the connection with the Akan people in Jamaica as well. This is all part of the ongoing program of the Black History Project of Lexington. That's the banner that's behind me of Quock Walker, done by a fabulous artist from Milton, Kamali Thornell. So hope that you will continue to join us as we learn more Black history in our Commonwealth and in our fine town of Lexington. Once again, I hope you'll join me in thanking our outstanding panel tonight. All of them added so much to my understanding and hopefully yours of what we can do and what we already know about doing for Massachusetts Emancipation Day and, of course, Quock Walker Day. Thanks to our partners and sponsors, the Historical Society of Lexington, and the Five Fields Real Estate and Compass. I'm very grateful for the team that worked with me on planning this. Louis Colon, Tanya DeSalfi, McCready, Stephanie Sue, Patricia Jacotin, and Letha Prespo. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a good night, and I hope that you will think of other ways that you can commemorate Quock Walker Day throughout the year, and again, on July 8th, 2022. Have a good night.